Thanks, Becca. My name is Katie C. I'm the Brownfields Redevelopment Specialist here and the TAB project lead. So I'd like to welcome you here today. You have an excellent panel who's going to be presenting you with information to help prepare you for this round of EPA Brownfield grants. Becca just introduced herself. And again, I am Katie. Carrie is our director here, and I'd like to extend the opportunity for each person on our team to introduce themselves this morning. So Carrie, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, I'm Carrie Staten, the director of WVU TAB, and mostly here today for moral support, but we are thrilled to be partnering with EPA and the folks at DNREC on all things, but specifically helping you prepare your EPA grant applications.
All right, Seth. Seth, make it back.
I believe Seth is experiencing some technical difficulties, so
we understand. All right, Tony.
Hi, I'm Tony Geiger, project officer with EPA Region 3. I've been with Brownfields for about 3 years now, so I'm looking forward to talking about our grants to everybody.
Thanks.
Hi, I'm Craig Anderman. I'm a project officer at Region 3 here in Philadelphia. I've been working with EPA for almost a year now, and I'm a project officer backup for DNREC for Tony.
All right, Sandy.
oh, Sandra, you are muted.
Okay. All right. Hi, I'm Sandra Woolston. I'm a planner here at DNREC, and I assist Melissa with any of the backup for brownfields and outreach and things like that. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Melissa Leckie. I'm the Planner 5 here with the remediation section at DNREC. We certify the brownfields here and do grants for the Brownfield program for our state, and I have over 18 years experience with Brownfield, so looking forward to working with you all today.
Thanks, everyone. All right, so again, my name is, since I'm Katie here, again, I'm with WVU TAB, and so that means we are the technical assistance to Brownfield provider for EPA Region 3. And so there are many types of service and assistance we provide to the folks within our region. All of that is free. Some of that includes educational outreach, which is why we are bringing you this webinar here today. We've got a great relationship with our partners in Delaware, and so we feel really good about the presentation we're going to be bringing to you today. And at the end of the presentation, we do want to take the opportunity to introduce some additional partners that we have at Delaware, but we'll save that and have that be a teaser for later in the session. But again, we welcome you to ask any questions that you have throughout the duration of the webinar. You can ask them in the chat. You also will have the opportunity at breaks. You'll notice we actually have scheduled in the opportunity for questions throughout the session. So please don't hesitate to reach out. If you have the question, there's a good chance that a lot of other people may have them as well. So please, we hope you feel comfortable enough to ask questions, because we want this information to help you be as successful as possible with your grant application. So today, we're going to cover an overview of the available Brownfield grants for this round of funding. We're also going to give you some details for those specific applications. We're going to let you know how TAB can help. We're also going to keep you posted on important dates to come, and we will have the opportunity for questions. And there are also some actual case studies that Delaware has chosen to highlight, and that will be shown at the end of this presentation as well. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Tony.
Thanks, Katie.
Sure.
So the Brownfields grants we offer from EPA we refer to sometimes as the MARC grants. That's multi-purpose assessment, revolving loan fund, and cleanup. This year, we are not offering revolving loan fund grants. The availability of different types of grants sort of varies year to year, depending on funding and just the grant periods and things like that. So we kind of stagger them. Some years we have ARC, assessment, revolving loan, and cleanup. Some years we have MAC, multi-purpose assessment and cleanup. So this year is MAC. Next slide. This is just a quick look at our timeline for how the grants are submitted and sort of evaluated. So right now we are in the application period. We'll be getting them in November 13th. You'll be getting lots of reminders about that deadline. And then we'll go into threshold eligibility review sort of through the end of the year and into the beginning of next year. National review is where all of the EPA regions all over the country are reviewing the applications they've received and scoring them. And then sort of later in the spring, we get into the final selections. And in May, we finally announce the grant winners, if you will. Next slide. All right, so here are the grant types and amounts that you could apply for in this funding cycle. So this will show you the project periods, which have been increased. Actually, they used to just be 3 years. We were finding that could be a little tough sometimes with setbacks of various types for work to be finished in 3 years. So we upped the grant period to 4 years and even 5 years in some cases for multi-purpose and community-wide assessments for states and tribes. And in addition, the amounts per grants have increased. This is in part thanks to the bipartisan infrastructure law. We have had some extra funding to spread around the country in the past couple of years, which is really nice. So this is just kind of a basic breakdown of the grants and amounts. And you can see, some of these grants up to 1.5 million, you can get a pretty good chunk of change for your application and for the grants you're awarded. So, next slide. Eligibility is important. Before you can apply for a grant, you have to make sure you're eligible. So the full list of eligible entities and sort of further descriptions in case you had questions are available in the grant guidelines, but these are the 5 basic categories. You could be a state, local government, a tribal government, and of course, local governments are going to include cities and municipalities, townships, general purpose units of local government, regional councils or redevelopment agencies, nonprofit organizations, and quasi-governmental organizations. So, some of these can seem a little vague. Something like quasi-governmental, might be a commission or a land bank. So you see various types of organizations coming in, especially if you are planning to do a coalition grant. You need to make sure all of your entities qualify to be eligible for that grant. So really the best advice here is if you're not sure, just ask because the time to ask is before you start your application. Next slide. All right, we're going to hand it over to our friends at DNREC.
Yep. Good morning, everybody. I'm going to take this section. So going over the threshold for all grants, the threshold eligibility criteria ensures applicants are eligible to receive the EPA MARC grants. They're on a pass-fail based on the certain requests for information identified in the upcoming slides. The information submitted is used by EPA only to make eligible determinations for the grants, and the applicants that pass all the threshold criteria will be evaluated against the evaluation criteria in the Section 5A of the grant solicitations. Response to these criteria are required and must be included as an attachment to the grant narrative, which is included in the submission. Next slide, please. For the multi-purpose grants, look at applicant eligibility, the community involvement, the target area you're looking at, the affirmation of the brownfield site ownership, use of the grant funds, expenditure of the existing grant funds. Looks like at least 70% of the funds from EPA must be drawn down by October 1st, 2023. And contractors and named subrecipients need to be listed. Next slide, please. For the community-wide and state and tribal, it's the applicant eligibility, the community involvement plan, Expenditures of existing grant funds, again, with the 70% of the funds must be drawn down by October 1st, 2023 at the target areas or the priority sites. And the named contractors and subrecipients again. Next slide, please. So looking for like the coalition groups, again, you need the applicant eligibility form, number of eligibility of non-lead coalition members, the target areas, existing Brownfield grants to non-lead members, excuse me, the coalition agreement, the community involvement, and expenditures of existing grant funds of the 70%. And again, the named contractors and subrecipients. Next slide, please. Now we're for the cleanup grants. So for the 15 steps, you need the application eligibility, the previously awarded cleanup grants, expenditure of existing multi-purpose grant funds, site ownership, basic site information, status and history of the contamination at the site, affirmative statement that site meets Brownfield site definition, environmental assessments required for cleanup, the site characterization, the enforcement of the action, sites required a property specific determination, threshold criteria related to the CERCLA petroleum liability portion, and the cleanup authority and oversight structure that you'll be using, along with the community notification, and the contractors and named subrecipients. Next slide, please. So for the site characteristic, the applicants must show that there's been sufficient level of site characterization, from the ESA performed to date for remediation to begin. And that determination must be made by us here at DNREC. Next slide, please. So for a site to be eligible for a brownfield, you have to get a letter from us requesting the following: that it affirms eligibility for brownfield, indicates whether the site is or will be certified, that there are no responsible parties, that the site will not be assessed, investigated, or cleaned up by a person that's potentially liable for cleaning up the site, that the site may not be subject to a corrective action order under the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, RCRA, and the site is a relatively low-risk petroleum site compared to other petroleum sites in the state and is not eligible for the federal trust funds. Now, if it's not eligible for brownfields, this is the criteria that will show that it's not eligible. So that there are viable responsible parties for the site, that the site will be assessed and investigated or cleaned up by a person that is potentially liable for cleaning up the site, that the site is subject to a corrective action order under the RCRA Act, and that the site is not a relatively low-risk petroleum site. Next slide, please. Now for the program qualifications, nonprofit applications must be able to document their legal status as a nonprofit. The application must affirmatively demonstrate that they did not cause or contribute to the release. The applicant is in full compliance with all other environmental requirements in Delaware, and that the applicant must not be a chronic violator. The applicant must not be subject to any current enforcement action from any state or federal environmental agency unless such enforcement action is, in the opinion of the secretary, adequately resolved. And the project shall not cause the loss of a greenfield resources per the purpose of the Brownfields Development Program. And we have on the slide link to our Delaware Brownfield funding policy, which details all this.
Hey, Melissa.
Yes.
Hi, sorry. We just got a question in the chat. Would you be able to expand on the viable PRP criteria?
Yes. So if, I guess for the EPA requirements, excuse me, so where are we at?
Right, which slide?
Sorry, so I can read what it says exactly again.
Which slide is it? I'm looking.
I think that might be one of the EPA requirements, not our state
Oh,
requirements.
thank you.
Back one more.
No, sorry, guys.
I think it was So Kimberly said it was the one right before the last slide that you were on.
Ah,
So sorry, go back to the one
this one?
we were on. Yes, this one.
Ah,
First bullet point on the right.
good job. Thanks. Here we go.
So I guess in that case, and Tony can kind of jump in and detail if I don't explain it exactly correctly, but I guess for the EPA requirements that there has to be kind of they can't have a PRP that I guess they could go after and recover funds from for the EPA status. Is that correct, Tony?
Yep, that's correct.
So whereas the state, we're not necessarily strict under our Brownfield program, but there are some sites where the site is an orphan site. There's no viable party available to go after. I hope that answers the question. If not, feel free to ask us to expand more. We can go a little bit far. Yeah, I think we're in the next slide. Okay, so on this slide here, this is for the state Delaware Brownfields program, our current funding eligibilities. I know today we're talking a lot about the EPA grants, but the state has a Brownfield program and funding available to Brownfield developers as well, which you could, leverage with each other. And we can discuss that later on if you want, but we're just going to discuss the funding current limits for public and nonprofit entities. They are eligible for $600,000 for investigation remedial activities. We have an additional $25,000 for offsite groundwater investigation, $100,000 for offsite groundwater remediation and hotspot removal, $40,000 for long-term stewardship activities, $25,000 for sustainable green remediation activities, and $15,000 for environmental justice activities for public outreach and different things that will be needed for those activities. Now for private entities, we have $200,000 for investigation and remedial activities. And then we also have a small business qualification that allows for additional $50,000 in grant funding for making $250,000 for investigation and remedial activities. Then again, we have all the additional pots of money that I spoke of in the public and nonprofit entities as well for that group. Next slide. Okay, I think we're handing this one back over to the EPA.
Yep. So this is just an eligibility chart. If you have an existing Brownfields grant. So I was mentioning before about your grant periods. One of the important things to remember is you do have to have your grant funding spent down 70% if you do want to apply for a new grant. So I'm not sure if folks here have an existing Brownfield grant, but definitely good to cross-reference this. Make sure you are eligible now to apply for a new grant and for the type that you're interested in. These charts are available on our website as well and in the guidelines. But if you're not sure, again, just ask us and we can let you know if you are eligible.
Hey, Tony.
Yeah.
So Kimberly added some clarification in the chat to her question that she sees a lot of owners who might have ability to clean up, but the costs are too overwhelming for their assets. And in all likelihood, if it's an entity, they'll just declare bankruptcy. She normally represents an innocent buyer who also cannot make the investment to clean up and then start whatever business they want to do. So she thinks she just wants to confirm that those situations are not a no-fly zone.
Yeah, so sorry, I'm just reading the question again. So yeah, I think in that case they're most likely going to be eligible. you know, it's just a matter of being able to demonstrate that, you know, it's just not that those owners aren't, you know, potentially viable in that situation. So
Thank you.
Mhm. So sorry, yeah, just going back to that previous slide. Next one over. So this sort of the take home here is you can apply for multiple applications. It just sort of depends on which type. I guess an important note is, you know, you can apply for an assessment and cleanup grant at the same time, which can be useful for some communities. And then a lot of these other things, you know, apply for states or states and tribes. So this, you know, again, is available if you wanted to cross-reference on our resource page. Next slide. And then we're going to turn it over to Craig to talk to you with some more specifics about the grant types.
Thanks, Tony. Yeah, I'll be walking you through the different grants and activities and the new updates for the year. First, we'll start with the multi-purpose grants. So the EPA is offering a more cleanup grants than in the previous years. So we are highlighting the multi-purpose grants this year. These grants are best for communities that have identified a discrete area with one or more brownfield sites. Funding must be used to conduct both assessment and cleanup activities. And the recipients are required to conduct at least one phase 2 ESA and one cleanup per site. And they must develop an overall plan for revitalization of a target area if one doesn't already exist. And the plan must include a feasibility reuse strategy for at least one priority site. And also the applicant must be the sole owner of at least one brownfield site within the target area by November 13th. Next slide. So the eligible activities encompass a range of tasks, including developing inventories of brownfield sites, prioritizing sites, conducting community engagement activities, conducting environmental site assessments, developing cleanup plans and reuse plans related to the site, and to carry out cleanup activities on brownfield sites owned by the applicant. And finally, developing revitalization plans. Next. So the changes to the grants this year, to the multi-purpose grant, it increased the funding from $800,000 to $1 million. And then it also added participant support costs that are available to the community attendees. And they include stipends for attendees, like your bus fare or whatever, what have you, attendee travel costs, and childcare expenses. Also, in the application itself, they asked to provide examples of how underserved populations have been involved prior to and during ongoing community involvement activities. Next slide. So next we'll talk about the assessment grants. The three types of grants are coalition, community-wide, and state and tribal. Tony touched upon these matrix previously. Next slide. So eligible activities for assessment grants include conducting site inventory, site prioritization, and site assessments. You can conduct site redevelopment plans, conduct community involvement, and facilitate area-wide planning, and advance local cleanup and redevelopment planning centered around brownfields impacted areas. And lastly, you can conduct travel and training activities. So some changes to the assessment coalition grants. They have increased the funding from 500 to 1.5 million. and you need at least 2 sites to be assessed in each member's boundary. And that was an increase from 1 from last year. And then again, the participant support costs available include the stipends for attendees and attendee travel to meetings, and then it can cover childcare expenses as well. Next. So for cleanup grants, the eligible activities include program reporting, cleanup, oversight, environmental monitoring, redevelopment planning centered around a brownfields impacted area, sampling activities, and cleanup alternatives with specific cost estimates are required. So for a cleanup grant, you must be the sole owner of the site at the time of submission of the application, and the owner must have conducted all AAIs prior to acquiring the property. This is typically in the phase 1 ESA, and that must be conducted 180 days before the property transfer. Next. So the changes to the cleanup grants, they are up from 2 million. I'm sorry. The funding has increased from up to 2 million to up to $5 million, depending on the category. And then the state determination letter must indicate that the information for FY24 cleanup grant application is in the state letter, and it requires that it isn't from a previous application. And then on the application, you need to, or you should provide examples of how the underserved population has been involved prior to and during ongoing community involvement activities. And then regarding guidance on classifying construction costs, the EPA recommends applicants apply the principal purpose of the contract test. And that's if the principal purpose of the contract is for construction services, then the cost contract should be placed on the construction budget line. Next. So for community notification, you're required to place an ad in the local newspaper or equivalent to communicate with the target community no later than 2 weeks before the application submission. And the ad must include where the draft application and APCA is located, the instructions on how to comment on the draft, date, time, and location of any public meetings. Next. So this slide just reviews what changes have occurred to all the application or all the grants. So for the grant applications, you need to provide specific examples of how proposed project will address EJ challenges and climate vulnerabilities and adaptations. And also you need to describe your efforts to promote strong labor practices, local hiring, or link members of the community to potential employment opportunities and brownfield activities related to your project in a meaningful and equitable way. Next. And with that, we'll take any questions you might have. Okay, we can move on.
Okay, is that me? Okay. So I'm going to do the narrative information sheet. Limited to 3 pages. They're not, they don't want to read, when you submit your application, they don't want to read more than the 3 pages, so try to keep it concise. You're going to want the name and full address, funding requested, the grant types, federal funds requested, the amount, and then the cost share waiver is not for FY24, and the location, the property information, site specific assessment, and cleanup only. contact information, population of your jurisdiction or the target areas, and then other factors. You do want to have a letter of support from DNREC. You can get that from Melissa or the DNREC coordinator. And then releasing copies of applications. You want to remember not to put any personal or confidential information in there, as it could be released to the public. The federal forms. So the federal forms needed are the application for federal assistance, budget information for non-construction programs, EPA key contacts form, any pre-award compliance review request reports, project narrative attachment form, attach the narrative information sheet, narrative and required attachments as one file. And then they have sample federal forms and guidances for, and I suggest their website is fabulous with all the forms and everything always being updated. They suggest don't leave any blank areas on the applications. If it doesn't apply, put NA. And don't assume anything, always ask questions. West Virginia's here, DNREC's here to help support you. Okay, analysis of brownfield cleanup alternatives, the ABCA cleanup grants. Okay, so the site and contamination issues should be included, cleanup standards and applicable laws. The cleanup alternatives considered for each alternative considered, and the alternative chosen, including information on the effectiveness, ability of the applicant to implement, the resilience to address potential adverse impacts caused by extreme weather events, the cost and analysis of the reasonableness, and the proposed cleanup. So this is where you want to identify your issues or the issues and standards are identified. Okay, the grant package, letter from DNREC, State Environmental Authority. So this letter from DNREC, a support letter, is required attachment for all grants. It should acknowledge the state's awareness and support of the project. New is the site characteristic level from ESA, and then one letter can be used for multiple applications. The contact for the state letter would be Melissa Leckie, and her email is there. Requests should include a short summary of the grant concept, allow at least 1 week for turnaround time, and we're requesting that any requests for letters be submitted by November 3rd. And from what I understand, and EPA can correct me, if we're running up against the deadline and for some reason you have to submit it after the 3rd, you can let them know and submit the request with the application, and then that gives DNREC a little bit of time to get that letter out. And then include details, what and where an area to be added or to be addressed, and then it's more helpful the more information and the more familiar. You want to write it like nobody knows what you're talking about, basically, but still keep it concise. Or we will. Okay. The grant package, narrative criteria for all grants. This is the meat of your application, project area description and plans for revitalization. So the target areas and brownfields, the background and description of the target area, descriptions of the priority brownfield sites, revitalization of the target areas, reuse strategy and alignment with revitalization plans, your outcomes and benefits of the reuse strategy, and a strategy for leveraging resources. So resources needed for site reuse and the use of existing infrastructure. I would just suggest to read all of the instructions because they are there, so you don't want to kind of skip around, and reach out to DNREC if you're not sure about something. We're here. And then of course, West Virginia. Okay, next slide. Narrative criteria, community need. You want to explain the community's need for funding. Get them on board early. Threats to sensitive populations. Community engagement is the project partners, project partner roles, and incorporating community input. Extend that plan to communicate project progress to community affected by a project. Work will be involved, and extent Their input will be considered, and to the extent their input will be considered in a meaningful way, and then explain the community need for funding and describe why the small and or low income community is unable to secure funding for the brownfield activities. Describe how the grant will meet the needs of the small and or low income communities. So yeah, you want to talk about your impact, the efforts, and how it will be a catalyst to other projects. What's the benefit, the value, and try to use numbers if possible, because that will help your application along. But
I would just like to say that this is the opportunity for you all to take advantage of the EJ screen tool through the EPA. So they have some information. So this is where you're going to pull that information to talk about which areas of your community are experiencing such issues. And also, anytime you start to dive into census information, if that's anything that is overwhelming to you, we have Seth on our team who could certainly be available to help either answer some questions or help pull some data as well. This is very important, just as Sandy was saying, show those numbers, talk about that information, and use that to help strengthen your application.
okay, the narrative criteria part 3, the task descriptions, cost estimate, and measuring progress. You want the project implementation, anticipated schedule, the task and activity lead, and your outputs, cost estimates. Remember to fully explain any participant support, cost, and processes. Discuss how you identify additional sites in assessment for the assessment grant. Be clear on how your cost estimates were calculated and estimated, and for assessment, projects that allocate at least 40% of the funds to tasks directly associated with site-specific work, like phase 1 and phase 2, are site-specific cleanup planning will be evaluated more favorably. Next slide. Okay, the task descriptions, cost estimates, and measuring progress. This is just an example, and they're pretty detailed. And the more detailed you are with these items, the better it will. Well, the more easier your application will be to review for your review. Okay, task descriptions, cost estimate, and measuring progress. The outputs. Cleanup grant outputs include, but are not limited to, cleanup plans, community involvement plans, financial analysis of brownfields, cleanup alternative documents, administrative records, and cleanup completion report or letter. And then the assessment grant outputs include, but are not limited to, site inventories, phase 1 and 2 ESAs, site cleanup plans, planning activity deliverables, and community meetings. There are a lot of great tools and eligible planning activities if you use the EPA Brownfield website. Okay. So the task descriptions, cost estimates, and measuring progress. Measuring environmental results, anticipated outputs, and outcomes. Discuss your plan to track, measure, and evaluate your progress in achieving project outputs, overall project results, and eventual project outcomes. Your tracking tools to consider are software products, progress reporting, scheduled team progress meetings, and contractor support. And then your accomplishments, your status on leveraging other critical funding, and strides towards accomplishing redevelopment vision plans. So this is your ways to track, measure, and report. And I think West Virginia University uses a free project management software to, track theirs. And it's just, it definitely helps things along, especially if you're going to fill out another application.
That's correct. We use a free software, and it helps us track along as we go along, and then that prepares us to enter our information into acres for the quarterly reporting. So anything that helps move that process along, we're all for.
All right. This is the narrative for the cleanup only, task descriptions, cost estimates, and measuring progress. So the proposed cleanup plan should outline the cleanup plans proposed for the site, briefly describe the contaminated media to be addressed, the cleanup methods and disposal requirements, and then can pull from the ABCA. Reviewers will not see the ABCA, so make sure the important information is in this section as well. If you have to repeat information, I suggest just repeating it if you have to. Okay, next slide. Let's see, programmatic capability and past performance. So the organizational structure will explain how your team will be structured to ensure that the grant will be carried out successfully. Your description of key staff is to discuss the key staff that will work together successfully to implement the grant. And acquiring additional resources, discuss the systems in place to acquire any additional expertise and resources. So the organizational structure is just your team skills and what they would bring to the table. Your description of the key staff is how they'll work together, and then acquiring additional resources. You might want to explain, this is where you address if you know somebody's going to retire or somebody leaves, how are those staffing changes going to be addressed? So that's where you want to include all that information here, and your community members, how they'll be involved as well. Next slide. Okay, programmatic capability and past performance. So you must answer one of the three categories to identify yourself in at least one of these three. The applicants who currently have or have previously received an EPA Brownfield grant. Number two, applicants who have not received an EPA Brownfield grant but have received other federal, non-federal assistance grants, and applicants who never received a federal or non-federal assistance agreement. So of course, number one, best, if you've received one before, you're going to demonstrate your experience. And the two, you want to explain how you've managed a grant. And number three, you don't get points, but it doesn't count against you either. Next slide. Okay, sam.gov. So the system for award management is the SAM is an official website of the U.S. government. There's no cost to use it, and you can use the site for free to register to do business with the U.S. government, update or renew your entity registration, check the status of an entity registration, and search for entity registration and exclusion records. It can take at least 2 weeks or more to complete to get through to the final process, and you have to renew it annually. So make sure you want to get that done. Yes, and then if you have questions about it, definitely reach out and ask. They really are responsive. They're quick for it. So the SAM.gov, you may already have it. If your organization has applied for federal funding, not just EPA funding in the past, you may already have a SAM.gov account and number. And then the people to check with would be your organization's leadership, city county clerk, city manager, or grant writer manager. And then let's see, to register, check status, and renew, you go to www.sam.gov, and you will need your unique entity ID, your tax ID number, your bank routing number, account, and account type, checking your savings to set up the electronic funds transfer. All non-federal entities must mail original, signed, and authorized letter to the Federal Service Desk within 30 days of activation. And then don't forget, it must be renewed every 12 months. You must be active when applying for grants, and make sure your contact information is correct, up to date, and it's free to register and renew. Watch out for scams. Is this 2 weeks? Okay, is this every, it could take 2 weeks every year, possibly? Or it's not,
it could take 2 weeks for the initial setup, and then I'm not going to lie, sometimes there are some issues that you may run into even after you already have your account set up, and just with working through the process can be time consuming. So it's not something you just want to underestimate the time that it could take. And just as you said earlier, the fact that someone in your organization has signed up for a SAM.gov account, if they have a federal grant, find that person, find out that login information. If you need to update it, if that person no longer works there, all that information can trip you up. And Carrie evangelizes about this, Carrie, our director. So it's very important that, just as you said, renew it every 12 months. Again, not necessarily for a Brownfield grant, but for any type of federal funding that you have. Don't just assume that it's okay. Make sure if your address changed, even if that is just for, a procedural thing that 911 addressing does, from time to time, make sure that that is accurate. And yes, please don't fall for scams. If you need any help with SAM.gov, contact us for free. You don't need to pay. We're here to help you try to navigate that process. Did we cover this one already?
Craig did it. I can do it. Okay. Oh, and now we're going to hand it back to Tony or Craig.
Yeah, so it's important to remember that this is a competitive grant process. So not everybody's going to be awarded a grant, obviously, and that's where our debrief process comes in. So if you're unsuccessful with your grant application this round, you are entitled to a debrief with the EPA. And this is something that will likely be conducted with a project officer like myself. It's an opportunity to answer any questions you had. We would go through the application section by section, and the person that you're having your debrief with is most likely privy to all of the notes from those folks that were reviewing your application. So they will compile those notes, and they can really share specific info with you on how to improve your application for the next round. So it's incredibly valuable. We have had many applicants who come in one year and are not successful, and that they have their debrief, they come in the following year and they are successful. So it's definitely something to look into. And of course, you've always got your DNREC folks and your TAB folks to give you even more great tips. So keep that in mind.
All right, does anyone have any questions on all of this easy to digest information you just heard? And it's okay if you don't think of a question until after the webinar. You have the contact information for everyone here, and you can always reach out, except for the EPA. Don't call them right now. But they are fantastic people. I want to point that out.
No questions in the chat right now.
We should have put a quiz together for everyone.
I think you're right. Coffee may not have kicked in yet. All right, Seth, are you ready?
I'm ready if you all can hear me.
We can hear you.
Becca, did you want to kick off the poll before we go over this? Or?
Oh, yes. Okay, so as part of our grant requirements as your TAB provider, we do have to keep track of certain stats. So I've launched this post-webinar poll for everyone. If you've got the latest version of Zoom, it'll just pop right up on your screen and you can answer that one poll question. This helps us with our data. So please go ahead and answer that. And while you're doing that, Seth will get started.
So as Becca said, I'm going to do some wrap up and some housekeeping while we're taking that poll. I'm not sure if Katie introduced me at the beginning because I'm having some gnarly technical difficulties this morning, but I am Seth Cardwell. I'm the Community Development Associate. I've been on the WVU TAB team for a little over 3 months now. You'll see a lovely little picture of me at the end, so you know I'm not just some enigma floating with my camera off. But WVU TAB is here to help. All of the assistance and the technical assistance that we provide to Brownfield communities is free. And as the TAB provider for all of EPA Region 3, we offer Brownfield education, which includes trainings, webinars, and events. Webinars like today's are included. resource identification. We can help with grant writing assistance, grant review, and creating resource roadmaps. We can also help with local brownfield program support, helping with creating brownfield inventories, questions on brownfield sites, as well as technical support related to those sites, as well as helping with project development and design assistance. We provide site-specific design assistance with design support from WVU's Davis College. And some important deadlines to remember: November 3rd is the deadline to submit draft applications to our office at WVU TAB for review. November 3rd is also the deadline to submit a request for letter to the DNREC. And November 13th is the EPA grant submittal deadline. That deadline occurs at 11:59 p.m., but we always encourage you to get it in early if you can, pending any technical difficulties like I've had this morning. And some resources and references for you all. These are all hyperlinks. So when you get the PDFs of the slide deck after the meeting, you should be able to click and access all of these. If you can't, we encourage you to email one of us to let us know that the links aren't working. But through these, you can find upcoming events and webinars, grant writing resources, state-specific resources, link to funding opportunities and EPA eligible planning activities, as well as a link to the EPA EJ screen that Katie brought up earlier. And some more resources and references. You can find past and upcoming EPA webinars at that link, and DNREC resources can be found at the second link. And as always, we encourage you all to stay connected. So we wanted to include the little headshots and the contact information for the lovely folks at the EPA and Delaware who have helped with today's call and presented alongside us. And we wanted to take a moment to introduce our TAB partners. As of October 1st, we've partnered with the University of Delaware with TAB. We do not have the contact information because we are still working on hammering out details for this, but we did want to make their faces and their names known. I think a couple of them are on the call, but you'll have the opportunity to connect and work with them later. And then our information on the left-hand side, you'll find contact information and headshots again for the people in our office. And at the very bottom is the WVU TAB email. Becca's usually the one that directs those emails to relevant persons when they come through. And there's my headshot, so you all can see what I look like. And we always encourage you to stay connected. Follow us on X and Facebook at WVU TAB on both platforms. Also included a link to our website. We encourage you to sign up for our newsletter. And we're really pushing this year to schedule a one-on-one consultation if you have any questions or need to meet with our office about a potential application. That not only helps us to better understand the issues that you have and the questions that you have, but it also helps us to get that one-on-one FaceTime with people in our office so we can get to know you better.
Great job. Thanks, Seth. I believe we have some misplaced slides here, or maybe this was the plan all along, but I need to bring, I think, EPA back and maybe in conjunction with Delaware, but they wanted to highlight some brownfield success stories there in your backyard in Delaware.
Yeah, I just wanted to add these in case we had time at the end.
I think they're great.
And it looks like we do. And, it's, I think, great to just see some examples of projects that have occurred in Delaware. And, I think the first thing to point out is none of these happen in a vacuum. It's always partnerships. In a lot of these cases, state and federal money went in, city funding. So the first one we always like to talk about, I think it's one of everyone's favorites, is the Wilmington Brew Works. And Sandy and Melissa, feel free to chime in on this one. I just have some basic bullets of how I understand that the story came together. And like I mentioned, it was really mostly DNREC, Hazardous Substance Cleanup Act funding for the cleanup. And then there was a little bit of EPA assessment funding, seed funding, and then Wilmington Urban Development Action Grants. So you can really see how it came together from assessment through cleanup, right up through redevelopment. And this was just a really cool building. They managed to preserve a lot of this architecture. So I think it was pretty amazing how, this was just transformed. And this is just one of many examples in Delaware, it turns out, where brownfields have been transformed to breweries. And really all over, you're seeing that now. These old industrial properties tend to lend themselves to that sort of brewery feel, I guess. So, you know, did you have anything to add, Melissa or Sandy?
I was just gonna say that, you know, a lot of these projects do work, like Tony said, in conjunction with EPA funding and state funding, and sometimes even municipality funding, depending on the location. And I think they make projects come into, you know, be redeveloped, which they wouldn't be. Again, the Harper Thiel site was years and years of just sitting there. And again, like Tony said, they preserved the, you know, Spanish style architecture. And now besides the brewery, there's also a pizza restaurant in there. So it's obviously thriving. And that's what we want to see from these redevelopment projects, you know, that they're successful and bringing something back to the local economy.
So, and I think we have one more. This one is more like in process. So the Diamond State salvage site in Wilmington, this is another one in Wilmington, had, you know, some EPA grants go into it, and then definitely some DNREC money again. So we used to have a grant type called area-wide planning grants, which has since been discontinued. But this site was identified as a catalyst site. So the idea being if this spot was redeveloped, then, you know, all the areas around it would then sort of increase in value and hopefully get some redevelopment interest. You are actually able now to do some planning activities with the assessment grants, which is nice. So, you know, even though area-wide planning grants went away, there's still the ability to conduct planning activities with their assessment grant. So the city of Wilmington is now kind of finishing out their last assessment grant to sort of work on these reuse plans and coordinate with DNREC. And, you know, DNREC's providing the bulk of that funding for the cleanup and remediation. So I think there's some concept plans on the next slide, but Melissa and Sandy, if you have anything to add.
Yeah, I was gonna say a project like this specifically, you know, it's not just one site, it's a whole area. You know, for this site, they're looking at creating a whole new football field for one of the local high schools, you know, athletic facility, along with some new businesses and walking trails. So it doesn't have to be just a one site project. In some cases, you know, you can look at multiple sites and work on a redevelopment plan for an area versus just one property, utilizing all these funding resources.
Thank you both. The link that you'll see in the previous slide that Seth covered here a few slides ago does include links to eligible planning activities if you do apply for an EPA Brownfield assessment grant. So you do need to make sure that 40% of your grant is in fact assessment work, phase 1 and phase 2, but you also have the opportunity to do some very cool, very essential planning activities that can help set you up for something this great.